Hello and welcome to another online reflection from the North Western Baptist Association. Some years ago we were on holiday as a family and we were staying in a small fishing village where lots of the locals would go down to the quayside in the early evening and they'd cast their rods and they would catch some of the local fish. And a couple of days into this, my son, who was probably about 8 or 9 at the time, came to me and he said, "Dad, will you take me fishing?" Now, for me, that was quite a difficult moment because until that point in my life, I had never been fishing. I didn't have a clue what to do or where to start. But what struck me was the absolute confidence that my son had in me in that moment. It never entered his head that I wouldn't know how to do it. I wouldn't know what was involved. I wouldn't be able to just go off and do what he expected. I was his dad, and as far as he was concerned, I could do anything. Of course, that was a few years ago, and since then the truth has dawned, and of course now he realises that it's him who knows everything and it's his parents that he constantly needs to be putting straight. But I've never forgotten that moment. Partly because it prompted me to get to know a couple of locals who fixed us up with a shop that was able to sell us a cheap fishing rod and taught us the basics, and I've actually been fishing quite a few times since. And yes, by the end of that week, me and my son had even managed to catch a mackerel between us. But it also taught me, or perhaps it reminded me, of something about children and the incredible faith that they so often have in the people around them. As I said earlier, what I found so startling was to realise that until that moment, my son just assumed I could do anything. And it was his first step to that journey of realising that his dad wasn't the superhero that he thought I was. And I guess that this is one aspect of human nature that has never really changed, because when we look at the stories of the Gospels, there's one particular episode when Jesus places a child centre stage and he invites people not only to recognise the incredible trust and simplicity with which children often engage with the world around them, but he actually holds this up as an example that those who were serious about being part of his kingdom should follow. And it's interesting because this happened in a situation where you might say that his disciples were doing the exact opposite. They were locked into a debate around their status and their importance. You could even say that Jesus encouraged a group of people who were being quite childish to learn how to be childlike. So maybe we can take a look at this story together, and then we might spend some time reflecting on what it might say to us in the midst of our present experiences. So we read this particular episode in Matthew chapter 18, and I'm going to read from verses 1 to 6. Matthew 18, 1 to 6. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus, and they asked, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And he called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, "Truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And if anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung round their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea." Now, I've been inviting you to think in the last few of these reflections on what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, and particularly to consider that in the light of the words that Jesus is recorded as saying on the night before his crucifixion, when he's in the upper room. "By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love one for another." And we've thought a lot about love and what the Bible says about love as we've mulled over what Jesus says here. And so what I want to do now is perhaps shift our focus slightly and to think about that word disciple. And what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? And if you look at what Jesus has to say here, perhaps the first thing that we can recognize is it certainly isn't a status symbol or some kind of sign of spiritual superiority. And that's worth thinking about for a moment, because yes, the disciples were arguing about who was the greatest, because in the culture in which Jesus lived and breathed, it was not uncommon to see a rabbi travelling the streets surrounded by a group of disciples, and such people were seen as something of an elite, people to be sought out, often generously supported by benefactors. And to be a disciple of a well-respected rabbi was seen as something of a status symbol. I guess a bit like having a degree from a world-famous university in our society today. But it's pretty clear that when Jesus talks about discipleship, this is not at all what he's got in mind. In fact, he takes them to the other end of the spectrum and places a child in the centre of the crowd. And again, we might pause here just to recognise something of the cultural context in which he does that. Children really were seen in that society as being of relatively little importance. You might have read another occasion when a group of women brought their infants to Jesus for him to bless them. And the disciples just dismissed them and sent them on their way. And it's only when Jesus notices what they've done that he intervenes, and he insists that the children are brought to him. Because again, they were just going along with the culture of their day. But Jesus says no. The kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, operates by some very different values. And in the episode that we've just read, Jesus doesn't just accommodate or include the children. He places a child centre stage, and he directs everyone's attention to that child. And he offers the child as the example that everyone else can learn from. This is what my kingdom's about, says Jesus. If you want to enter my kingdom, if you want to understand the ways of my kingdom, then you need to be willing to change and become like a child. Now, like I said, Jesus was challenging a group of disciples who had a particular ability to get into childish arguments about who was the greatest, and he was challenging them to think about what it means to be childlike. So as ever, I want to invite you to spend some time reflecting on these few verses from Matthew's Gospel. And perhaps you could do so by putting yourself into that crowd of people that surrounded Jesus that day. Imagine yourself standing there, perhaps as one of those disciples wanting to know about greatness, or as someone who heard them ask that question and then watched as Jesus draws this child out from the crowd that you're standing in and places them to the very centre of everyone's attention. And as you relive this episode in your mind's eye, consider what God might be saying to you as your attention is fixed on this young, innocent child. And Jesus simply says to you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever takes the lowly place of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. Imagine how you might have reacted as you watch this episode unfold, and then spend some time considering what God might have to say to you through this in your here and now. Unless you change and become like a child. So what is it that's different in the attitude of a child to how you act and think? What might God be saying to you through that? Whoever is willing to take this child's position will become the greatest. Well, what does that mean for you? What does that mean about your place in God's kingdom? And whoever welcomes a little child welcomes me. So what does that say to you about Jesus? What does it say to you about how you engage and relate to those around you? And as you ponder these things, I want to offer you some thoughts of my own that you may or may not find helpful. First of all, I am struck again by the way in which children can be so trusting. Remember that story that I began with. My son just believed in me. It never entered his head that I wouldn't be able to work out how to fish and be able to take him. He trusted me. And of course, I was so impacted by his trust and his faith in me that I jolly well learned how to fish, and the two of us ended up spending many happy hours casting our line over the harbour wall, even if it did take the best part of a week to just catch one fish. But the fact that I didn't have a rod, or I didn't know what I was doing, or I didn't know where to start, was of no interest to him. He just trusted me. And maybe God has something to say to us in that. Because right now, for many of us, our world has been turned upside down. There is so much uncertainty and loss and struggle. And what is our adult instinct in circumstances like that? It's to question, it's to probe, it's to challenge. Where's all this leading? Whose fault is it? When's it going to end? And we can all so easily transport that into our faith. What is God saying? What's God doing? Why isn't God changing all these things? And I think there is a place for asking questions like that, so that we can grow in our understanding of God. But the place to start asking those questions is from a place of trust. We enter like a child. And if we can't figure out answers to all of those questions, then we learn from the child. God has one thing to say to us that we truly need to hear. You can trust me. And the second thing about a child is that they trust on the basis of relationship. My son expected me to teach him to fish because I was his dad. It was his relationship with me that prompted events, not my ability or disposition that I'd shown myself to have, not because I was some great fisherman. What mattered was his relationship with me. And coming to God as a child is to come to God in relationship. Not with ideas of status or wanting to know what benefits might come our way. And he came expecting to receive and ready to accept. And Jesus says, take that lowly place of a child and you will become the greatest. If you want to receive from God, then don't come with your own agendas. Just come ready to accept whatever God offers and brings. And while I realise how tough things are for many of us at the moment, and I don't say this glibly, but I do wonder whether we just simply need to accept our present circumstances and not allow ourselves to be torn apart by the inevitable frustrations and disappointments and concerns that our society is so constantly echoing at the moment. You know, I wonder if God might be offering us that image of a child as a simple invitation to let go and to let our trust lead to acceptance and to not allow ourselves to be consumed by worry, to be set free from that because we know that we can trust God. But of course, the other thing that Jesus points out is that children are vulnerable. And he makes that point particularly powerfully in verse 6. You know, there aren't many places in the Gospels where we hear words of such clear and strong condemnation on the lips of Jesus. It would be better to have a millstone around your neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea. Now, that is some outburst. So Jesus is very clear about how we respond to that vulnerability. But children are vulnerable. And of course, Jesus offers us this reality in a far more positive frame as well. Welcome children, he says, welcome the vulnerable child as you would welcome me. And perhaps this speaks to us about how we function as a community at the moment. You know, we might be feeling particularly vulnerable and fragile. And God says, that's okay. There's room and there's welcome in my kingdom for those who are feeling fragile. But he also invites us to think outwards, so to speak. Who else might be feeling vulnerable and fragile? And how can we be those who extend welcome and support to those who are particularly vulnerable, these little ones of mine, as Jesus describes them? And there's something of the dynamics of God's kingdom on display here. If you look for a minute, you notice that Jesus invites us to be like a child, and he also invites us to welcome the child. And if we were being pedantic, we could say, well, hang on a minute, that's a bit of a contradiction. But it seems to me that that's the point. God's kingdom is one where we share our mutual struggles. We recognise each other's vulnerabilities. We are both the welcomed and the welcomer. And we're not interested in status or symbols of greatness, but in mutually supporting one another as we recognise that we are all fragile. And so for me, as I watch this child being made centre stage on that afternoon somewhere many thousands of years ago in the hills and the roads of Palestine, I hear a God saying, trust me. I hear a God saying, accept what is happening. I hear a God saying, come to me in all your fragility and support one another in your shared vulnerability. So I hope these thoughts help you to spend some time in that crowd, so to speak, to replay and to observe those events in your mind's eye, but to do so prayerfully, asking what God has to say to you through them. Thanks for listening.